Since this course has to do with comics and politics, we ought to pause at this point to ask, what do we mean by politics? Because politics has several different meanings to it. It has several different dimensions to it as well. I would start at a point where maybe other people would not necessarily start, and that would be just a quick reflection on the concept of politics within the comics industry. I think most people at this point in time recognize that there is a pretty strong leftist bent to Hollywood in general. Now, that's not to say that everyone in Hollywood is a radical leftist, but certainly the industry has a strong tilt toward the political left. The same is true in the comics industry, although we might say that in some ways it's more pronounced. And another way of saying that, not quite so politely, would be to say that there's a certain radicalization within the comics industry that is sharper than we'd find in Hollywood in general. That hasn't always been the case. There was in the 40s and the 50s a conservative push within the comics industry, even an attempt to assist in the war effort in World War II. But that's not the case anymore. And so you can get some of the best in the comics industry right now, but you can find some of the worst as well. And in addition to that, we might say that because of the nature of the material that's sometimes dealt with in comics, perhaps the level of violence, as we discussed earlier, the element of sexism that is certainly still present, the freakish nature of comic book material. It's not hard to understand that at times it attracts people that might not be attracted in to another genre or another industry. I would even take it one step farther and say that at times there is a certain representation of the dysfunctional population that you find disproportionately represented in the comics industry, more so than in other entertainment industries. Some might find that offensive, but I don't think you have to spend too long in this world to recognize some of that, nor do you have to go to too many Comic-Con conferences, the conferences about comic books, to recognize that at times there's a certain profile of individuals that are attracted to this industry. I should say that with some apology, because there are a great many sound people, there are a great many people who are politically balanced, and even for those who are on the left, there are a great many reasonable people in that situation. So another then consideration of politics within the comics industry is something I alluded to a moment ago, and that is to say comics has been a vehicle of a certain kind of propaganda from time to time. That may not always be the nicest term, and it's not meant necessarily to be understood in a negative sort of way. For example, once again in the war effort, in World War II in the United States, there were times in which Superman in the comics was called into the service, and obviously in a hypothetical and creative sort of way, of the objectives and the goals of the Allied powers in World War II. And just as, for example, England used Shakespeare's Henry V during the same war as a way of inspiring the public. There was a remake of Henry V starring Laurence Olivier, again as a kind of propaganda. So it was used in the same way in the States. Now that has shifted over time, and the politics now that are promoted through comics and graphic novels are a different kind of politics for sure. And there are several episodes at which we saw a turn in that. Some of it is just a reflection of culture in general. Some of it is a reflection of the entertainment industry in general. But some of the move toward the left was, we might say, provoked by certain historical events. One of those would have been the U.S. invasion of Iraq under the presidency of George W. Bush. There were certain expressions within comics and graphic novels about that event and its aftermath that were critical, sometimes quite critical of the U.S. And as we'll explore a bit more, some comics began to chronicle what the authors perceived as an American decline. Another way to reflect on this shift in politics along the political spectrum would be, for example, to look at the U.S. presidents and how they have been conveyed in comics. Beginning, say, with Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, certainly with George Bush, the depiction of these characters in comics has been quite critical, at times quite ugly. Now, there have also been episodes in which an attempt to express the author's intention or the company's intention, political ideas through comics have been pretty darn clumsy. In recent years, Barack Obama has been depicted in comics, and I think in an embarrassingly romantic fashion. And there is an upcoming episode of a comic called Valiant, in which Hillary Clinton will be portrayed once again in an embarrassing and non-critical fashion. So, a lot to explore here, a lot to reflect upon, and this in some ways just scratches the surface of this particular dimension of politics. Another way to look at it would just be to try to analyze comics and graphic novels and identify where they fall along what we call the political spectrum. As an extension on this last point, we should recognize that not only have comics tried to promote a certain political view, and that view has shifted over time, but there's a way in which comics have also expressed a cultural movement throughout society. So we had a certain idea of what's heroic in the 1940s and 1950s. However, culturally, those sort of ideas began to change in the 60s and into the 70s and the 80s. And so you find that sort of thing reflected in comics. And sometimes perhaps it is inadvertent. It isn't necessarily intentional, but since entertainment is often not only something to promote a certain kind of culture, but an expression of culture, then you see this reflected as well. So then, as many have discussed, and especially in popular entertainment, as we move from the 60s into the 70s and the 80s and even to the 90s, you see a certain sort of existentialism, even a certain sort of nihilism that is at least a cultural sentiment. And for that reason, you find storylines and characters in comics who become more conflicted. They are less heroic. Some of them begin to take on a kind of an anti-heroic role. Things aren't as clear as they used to be. Things aren't as black and white as they used to be. And as comics express even a certain kind of nihilism, a certain kind of despair, a kind of anguish, that also is an expression of something that's happening culturally. So that's another reason why this genre is useful, because it helps us to understand not only the way in which culture is being promoted, but the way in which culture is evolving, and it's an expression of that culture.